Now we're going to move to our next session, Breaking the Mould. We're exploring mitigating the carbon impact of large-scale industrial facilities such as data centres and assessing carbon tax initiatives, identifying the new green technologies which can succeed in business and in environmental terms, plus expert insight into the emerging technologies being adopted by cement producers in response to changing consumer demand and governmental action to tax carbon emissions. So I'm delighted that we're joined today by three great speakers. Rebecca Lama from the European Investment Bank Chair Team, European University Institute Italy, also by Eric Trusovic, Industrial Decarbonisation Specialist from Spain, and also Adrian Burher, the co-founder and managing partner of Morgan Ventures in Switzerland. So we're going to hear presentations from each of our three speakers, starting with Rebecca. So if you want to go ahead, Rebecca, thank you.
Thank you. Good morning. So I would like to quickly go through some slides and talk about mitigating the carbon impact of large-scale industrial facilities. Going quickly from embodied carbon to carbon emissions during the operations of those facilities. Starting here, the demand-side opportunities could reduce EU industrial emissions by almost 300 million tons per year by 2050. So by what we see here in the slide, we will be talking about around 56% of reductions with attractive economics. These abatement opportunities fall into three major categories that we can see on the graph on the right side. So the first opportunity is it would be reducing around 60% of per year by 2050. That could be achieved thanks to materials recirculation opportunities. What does that mean? The economy is accumulating large stocks of metals and plastics, and by 2050, it could meet a large share of its need for these materials by actually recirculating what has already been produced. Some figures: 75% of steel, 50% of aluminium, and 56% of plastics. Cement is less enabled to recycling, although it is possible to reuse some unreacted cement. Recirculating materials cut CO2 emissions and requires much less energy than new production does. However, current practices are not set up to facilitate these high recycling rates. An influx of new materials is required both to replace metals and plastic that are lost and to compensate for downgrading of quality. So very important factor here is on the sorting, so then it can be duly recycled. The second option that we can see also in the graph, which will be amounting at 20% of the reduction per year, could be achieved thanks to higher product materials efficiency. These opportunities have in common that they reduce the total materials input to key products. So one strategy is to reduce the amount of materials that are lost in production. Here goes an example. Half the aluminium produced each year does actually not reach the final product, but actually becomes scrap, while some 15% of building materials are wasted in construction. And it's a little bit shocking as developers really look at the optimization of their procurement. And still 15% is lost. Another opportunity is to use more advanced materials and construction techniques, such as high-strength steel that can cut materials used by 30%, for example. And the last opportunity is also would be amounting around 20% of reduction per year by 2050, could be achieved thanks to new circular business models in buildings and actually also mobility, notably through sharing. This opportunity pivots on making much greater use of vehicles and buildings, which together represent a majority of European demand for steel, cement, and aluminium. Currently, the utilization of many of these assets is actually very low in Europe, about 2% for the average European car and about 40% for European offices, even during office hours. Sharing enables much more intensive use of assets. And as my mom would say, also sharing is caring. With a new policy framework, the basic materials industries can support an increased EU 2030 climate target of at least 55%. Key low carbon technologies are available and can be deployed actually well before the target of 2030. The CO2 abatement potential of key low carbon technologies in the steel, chemicals, and cement sectors alone by 2030 actually exceeds the required emissions reductions from industry under the EU emission trading system. Their deployment will represent a breakthrough in Europe's industrial sector and ensure it a leading global role. So we've talked about a little bit on the embedded carbon. Let's go through the operations of those facilities. I won't be talking about all of them, but I would like to tackle heating, for example. 40% of today's industrial natural gas used in the EU goes to heat below 100 degrees Celsius and can actually be supplied with technology that is known and in the market for a while, the heat pumps with performance factors exceeding 100%. Other low carbon options, apart from going electric, would be also biomass, heat networks. I'll come back to the heat networks after, green, blue hydrogen, etc. The investment window for fossil-based hydrogen with carbon capture remains open, but in the long run, renewable hydrogen will emerge as the most competitive option in Europe. However, we're raising here the point on hydrogen for heating. However, even for higher temperatures, a range of power to heat options can be more energy efficient than hydrogen. And so they should be considered first, meaning that we are ready to decarbonize the heating needs of industrial buildings, right? So we're ready, we have the technology, it's in the market. So go electric, prioritize always efficiency, meaning that it will be likely to be heat pumps and chillers. So if we have the solution, why in this slide we read that decarbonization of heating represents one of the most challenging aspects in achieving net zero? And we have the response, well, at least part of the response, capital intensive CapEx, and actually the heating system's choice depends on many variables. The complexity of decarbonizing this sector is increased by the upfront fixed cost and the range of technology options, right? When we say heat pump, we don't have one single option. And further complexity is due to having several variables in the heating system's equation. Namely, it goes beyond also technology. What are the country specifications, regulatory, and also the climate, building efficiency necessary to achieve comfort, building use, consuming persona. For example, in one 10,000 square meters warehouse, do we have 10 workers in place? Do we have 500? That might make sense for having forced air in place via heat pumps, or just spotted air via radiant tubes, for example. So after raising some challenges, I would like to shed a little bit of light as well. So currently, low carbon conversion technology is more expensive than high carbon solutions, as we were saying, very capital intensive CapEx, and consumer willingness to pay is actually low. Conventional gas boilers have a lower capital cost compared with heat pumps and other low carbon technology. Plus, the full cost of gas boilers will remain below those of heat pumps for as long as government subsidies remain without truly reflective carbon price. So consumers have very little incentive to install low carbon equipment or actually decarbonize heating. So as we can see here, the cost effectiveness of low carbon technologies will improve over time, and learning rates of 9 to 8% for every doubling of cumulative capacity are for gas. Market demand and deployment is required to deliver cost savings of high efficiency and renewable technologies, but cost savings alone are not enough to shift the market of heating. So I've talked a little bit about heating, and let's also talk about cooling of giant data facilities. We see here giant data facilities use about 40% of heat of their energy to keep their servers cool, so cooling. Quickly summarizing the technological solutions for those facilities, it can include passive cooling, which ensures hot and chilled air do not mix, and immersive liquid cooling, where servers are immersed in a rack filled with coolant that can have more than 1,000 times the heat capacity of air. The coolant absorbs the heat from the servers and is then removed from the rack. Some options to decarbonize all the energy and resources from that cooling. So many operators are already using, for example, artificial intelligence, some examples of which are saying it has cut cooling costs by 40% actually, just by using machine learning to apply the optimal amount of cooling at any time given. So 40% of reduction costs for cooling, and some studies actually say that optimizing by machine learning for heating consumption can go between 15 and 30%. So more potential of reduction in cooling. Also, other options that will support efficiency is also location. Location definitely helps. A global cloud services provider has used seawater to cool a facility in Finland, for example. Data centers can also simply be built somewhere cold, such as Iceland or northern Sweden, which hosts a number of the world's global hyperscale data center facilities. Another crucial approach is to siphon off the heat and use it for something else. As I was mentioning before, they would come back to heat networks for heating homes or greenhouses. This is a common practice in some cities already, for example, in Paris and Amsterdam. And another example in Switzerland, the heat from a data center warms a nearby swimming pool. So that's a way also to improve, like to improve communities, right? To finish before thanking, I would like to raise, well, lately we have heard the announcement that heating and transport will be subject to a separate emission trading system in the EU. And this is needed mainly for three reasons. One, heating and transport emissions are actually not moving. There is a need for a new instrument for pushing it forward. Second, upstream petrol and gas suppliers need an incentive to decrease the carbon intensity of their offer. And three, obviously, the new instrument would have to raise revenue to deal with the social impact in a targeted way. Let's be efficient as well. The good news, here they come, is that the role of technology and finance has never been more ready for this. Competitive renewable energy, truly the first Green Deal, is scaling up towards dominance of the energy markets and is finding its way into heating, into cooling, transport, into the food and water nexus, into green molecules, heavily contributing to Europe's decarbonization. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Rebecca, that fascinating presentation. We're going to hear from Eric next, so if you want to go ahead, Eric, with your presentation, thank you.
Is that good? Okay, thanks very much. So I'm going to talk a little bit about cement and concrete and the decarbonization of cement, which is one of the most difficult to decarbonize industries. I'm going to talk a little bit about the problem of CO2 in the sector and what are the main drivers for a change in the sector and some emerging technologies that are of a really broad interest in the sector. So first thing to understand is just the size of the sector. It's 4.1 billion tons of, of annual production, 2.8 billion tons of CO2, growing, and it's 90% located in the developing world. So this is pretty much a scale that's extraordinary and you know pretty much one of the largest sectors of human activity is the production of cement and concrete. It's growing faster than population. It's growing faster than other building materials such as steel, as you can see here. 90% of the developing world was more than half of the world's cement production was in China. That's declining, but it's being replaced by other developing geographies like India and Africa. It's also a material which is extraordinarily important to the development of those geographies. So without cement, you know, human development in the developing world, especially for infrastructure, for housing, et cetera, is not possible. So it's a really fundamentally important material. Cement production, this is a quick overview of cement production, extraordinarily capital intensive, $200 to $400 million for a cement plant, only 2,500 cement plants or so in the world. It involves digging out millions of tons of minerals and heating them up to around 1450 Celsius to produce clinker, and then grinding that with other types of materials to produce a final cement. So huge activity, extraordinarily capital intensive, and very hard to decarbonize activity. due to its scale primarily too. The production process of cement is very complex. It looks like a simple white powder, but it's actually a very complex production process. It has to control 4 phases of calcium silicates and calcium aluminates. Here's a little bit the phase diagram. I won't go in detail into this, but it looks like a white simple powder, but it's actually a fairly complex material to produce. This complexity doesn't end after delivery. Oops. This production doesn't end after delivery. The microstructure of cement, when cement is mixed with water, it transforms into a very complex microstructure that you can see at the right: calcium silicate hydrate, ettringite, and other types of materials. Calcium hydroxide primarily, which also protects some of the steel that's in cement. So this is, this white material, you mix it with water and it produces this microstructure, and that microstructure, it can last for 75 years. So it's a very, very long-lasting material also. Incredibly cost optimized, $20 to $40 cash cost per ton for a ton of cement. Imagine trying to hire someone to move a ton of material from one place to 100 meters from there. It's probably going to cost you more than this, and this is digging the material out of the ground, heating it up, controlling the quality, distributing it, etc. So that's $20 to $40 cash cost per ton, a big challenge for decarbonizing it. And then the competition in the industry is extraordinarily fierce. $500 billion to $1 trillion capital stock, $20 to $40 margin cost per ton. Really connected companies with a regulatory and standard influence. So new technology industry has to face this fierce competition. So that's a little bit of background on the industry. About the sources of CO2 in the industry, primarily it comes from a reaction called calcination. This is one of the reasons why it's so hard to decarbonize. You're taking limestone, which is calcium carbonate, and you're splitting that into a lime and CO2. So more than half of the emissions actually come from the mineral itself. So even if you use completely renewable energy, you still have billions of tons of CO2 emissions from the sector, making it very hard to decarbonize. 2019 was really a tipping point for the industry, in which not only were there regulations, that started to make a cost of CO2 emissions in more places, have a cost actually and not be free, but shareholders started to get really involved in looking at, what is the impact of the industry and trying to pressure the industry to take actions. So this is around 2019 that CO2 and cement moved from, one of the top 10 or 15 things on the agenda to top 3 for most multinational cement companies. And this is really because cement companies see that emitting billions of tons of CO2 to the atmosphere is not only in the European Union, but in a broader perspective in the world, going to be an activity that has a cost. And I would say the European Union leads in this way, in the current discussion on phasing out some of the free allocations to the industry, and the implementation of a carbon border adjustment mechanism are probably the most important regulatory developments for the world, for the cement industry currently. Talking a little bit about how the industry has responded to pressures, it has converted over the past couple of decades from a wet to dry process, which is much more energy efficient. It has increased the use of STMs. So STMs are supplemental cementitious materials, such as these, fly ash, slag, pozzolans, natural or waste product materials that can be used to substitute some of the high CO2 footprint materials with these waste materials, which is a very good thing for the industry. And it has also integrated alternative fuels, primarily in Europe. And the key to understanding this and the motivation of the cement sector and how to decarbonize and incentivize the decarbonization of these type of industries is to understand that, behind these 3 successes, there's not a desire, on the part of a commodities company to save the world. And that's not ever going to be the driving force of carbon reduction in the sector. But it's really, what things are positive or neutral to variable cost, and also respond to regulatory pressure. So when you think about how the industry has responded on each of these, all of these things are variable cost positive and response to regulatory pressure. So for instance, the alternative fuels in Europe is only deployed really in Europe because of the regulations on waste management there. And you can see this when you look at the global plan for the industry to 2050. Everything that reduces variable cost is very aggressive target, and things that don't reduce a variable cost are, pushed out further into the future. And I would say this is a problem of the cement industry itself, but this is just the natural role of the government in needing to push these things forward. So that's a quick background on what the cement industry has done. Looking at the new emerging technologies, you can classify into material, energy, and capture. You can look at the whole huge amount of innovation of the sector, but it's very important to take into account, the sector-specific characteristics that you need, widely available raw materials, something that has good economics, that fits with existing capital stock, and has a good ease of use. These can be classified into industrial feasibility and economic feasibility vectors. And when you look at this, 4 emerging technologies are really of interest, I think. One is a binder efficiency. So that's just reducing the interparticle space in the concrete matrix to use less cement. You can reduce, by even 50% the amount of cement in the mix by doing this, and the related CO2 by the same amount. The second one I'd highlight is really these emerging SEMs. So fly ash and slag are reducing in availability, and they're not, this is not a future SEM for the industry. Things like a calcined clay or LC3, a project from EPFL, I think are extraordinarily interesting for new technologies for reducing CO2 in cement. A third is carbon capture itself. So even if you use renewable fuel, renewable energy in the cement industry, you'd have more than 1 billion tons of CO2 to capture. So you need to do this at the lowest possible cost. Traditional approaches are very expensive. There's one called indirect calcination, primarily deployed in the European Union through the Lilac project, which is extraordinarily interesting. That's just getting a pure stream of CO2 by indirectly calcining the raw materials. And then a last area that I would highlight is new generation process controls. So that's applying ML and AI to industrial control of a cement factory and getting an additional 10, 15, or 20% efficiency from the factory. And then the last thing to highlight is really there's 25 to 30 billion tons of concrete made with cement, and all of this material is reactive to CO2. So this is a potentially enormous CO2 sink for the industry, or not for the industry, for the world to mine and to look for effective ways of mining and exposing to CO2 economically as a CO2 sink in the future. And I would say, in conclusion, you really need to understand the industry itself, the heart of gold that it has for variable cost reduction, the fact that commodities industries respond to economic incentives and CO2 costs. And this is something that needs to incentivize the industry. It's not going to decarbonize itself. And when you look at things through the vectors of industrial feasibility and economic feasibility, those are 4 of the interesting emerging technologies that come to mind. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Eric. We're learning a lot today. I knew there was so much to learn about cement, and what you're talking there about cost reduction and incentivizing the industry is extremely important. So the final of our trio is up next. Last but by no means least is Adrian Berger, the co-founder and managing partner of Uber Morgan Ventures in Switzerland. We're going to hear a presentation from Adrian. If you want to go ahead now, thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Do you hear me? Good. I continue. If you have listened to our previous speakers about heating or cement, I think that's where I want to start my presentation. If you have been reading the report from the IPCC about the global warming and how to keep it below 1.5%, what they say is we need a rapid and far-reaching transition of energy, land, urban infrastructure, just what we've heard before, including transport, building, and industrial systems. And we need that in an unprecedented terms of scale and also very, very fast. So basically, if I've been listening to Eric at the cement industry, or Rebecca in the heating industry, or to previous speakers, Thomas, he mentioned sustainability is the next competitive advantage. So basically, that is our mission. So we really see that this transformation, it needs to happen, and it needs to happen fast and on every scale. And that's where we come in. So we basically believe that humanity will somewhat find its way and not, I don't know, destroy itself by warming the planet to 4 degrees or more. And that means all these developments, they need to happen, they will happen. So why not proactively go there and proactively help those companies, those startups who are this change to make this happen. So we've heard that before. I think Eric said it well. The heart of the cement industry, it's not saving humanity. So what we need is governmental regulation. I mean, let's be clear about that. The change will not happen because everybody likes to save the world. The change will happen because government regulation makes carbon-intensive products and services more expensive. And they should do so. It's a matter of external costs. If we look at the damage from climate change, basically there is too much costs of the damage those goods do that is not priced into the goods. So we need regulation, and probably, I mean, there are several approaches here worldwide, but probably the best would be a carbon tax. But in any way, carbon-intensive products and services need to become more expensive. And infrastructure investments that basically explore such technologies like oil and gas, they need to be written off immediately. And on the other way, products that are carbon neutral or replace an existing technology with a technology that is better in reducing carbon, they should become more profitable. And the same goes for infrastructure, solar, wind, etc. As soon as the carbon incentive industry goes up in price, they become the better alternative. And that's what's happening already at the moment, just really not fast enough. So basically, that's the underlying thing that needs to happen. That means policymakers need to set the right incentives. We heard before, people need to adapt, and already are adapting more sustainable lifestyles, and also technology and business needs to innovate really, really, really fast. So that's what we're betting on. We're investing in startups early stage startups that basically develop technologies, services, and basically try to find those solutions we need in the future. So by putting money to those startups early stage, we believe we have the biggest impact, and we believe it's the best solution because startups are very disruptive. They rethink things in a new way. They're very fast. They try, fail, repeat, and they're very smart. So we see a lot of the smartest people, luckily on Earth, now moving into the climate space, now wanting to try to find solutions. So we have to say, I think it's the most cost effective, but also the fastest way to develop innovation where we need it. So just to say, you need to move the needle. So basically what we need to see is in each startup we invest, we need to see at least 100,000 tons of CO2 reduction annually in 10 years. So we really do an impact model and we want to see that happen. And also, of course, we want them to be financially successful, but that goes together. That's double impact. So we invest in startups that basically really only have an impact when they're also financially successful. To give you an example, I mean, there are examples in the industry that Eric mentioned, cement. I think Valentin from Neustark, he's also at the conference. He does a solution in cement. I've been talking to Valentin before. But I will give you just two short examples. One is one of our portfolio companies. It's called Unknown. So what they do basically, they build Europe's first lifestyle platform where you don't actually buy clothes, but you rent them. You get some sort of a subscription, so you get a parcel each month with 5 new clothes in it. You put your old 5 clothes to send them back. If you like something in particular, you can keep that. But basically, it's a rental service for clothes, and we did an impact model, and we found out that each trouser, each suit is worn 5 times more in the rental model versus in the buying model. And so you can develop an impact model, and you find out, wow, okay, we can really save those 100,000 tons plus CO2 each year, and customers like it. They get new clothes every month. Instead of buying them, they get cheaper new clothes. So it's an example of a service that is actually better liked by the customers and can have a huge carbon emission reduction potential. The second one I want to mention just quickly, it's Carboculture. Henrietta, she's also at the conference here. So what they do, they have a reactor where they can produce biochar in a way that is super carbon effective. So almost all of the carbon really goes into the biochar, and what comes out is a super clean biochar that can be used by several industries, for example, to purify water. But it can also just be put into the ground, and it will capture their carbon for between 100 and 1,000 years. And each ton of biochar captures 3.5 tons of CO2. So again, a superior product. It's better biochar than the biochar you can normally buy. It has a higher carbon effectiveness, and it's very much thought after by clients. So that's the kind of companies we are looking at. That's the kind of companies we want to invest in. And we think we have the highest impact with our dollar, euro, Swiss franc, whatever spent when we put it in these early companies. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Adrian. Now we're going to move to a Q&A session. So I've got some questions for you all after your presentations. Perhaps maybe we will start with Eric. If I could ask you, if you feel in your assessment, is there enough venture capital Green Deal funding out there to bring all these sort of new ideas to the mass market?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So I think it depends. I think that there's never enough investment, enough venture capital for these extraordinarily hard problems. You know, some of these problems in these industries will require trillions of dollars of investment. So it's good that there's an increasing amount of climate venture capital. I would say now, you know, funds like Breakthrough Energy Ventures have $2+ billion that they're investing into these sectors. I think there's more and more climate venture capital. I think the dearth of capital is actually at a different part of the capital stack, and that is, you know, how do you get first of a kind projects done? How do you invest, you know, hundreds of millions into industrial deployment installations of these technologies? Once you get them, there's a lot of capital to get them to lab scale and maybe a little bit beyond lab scale, but how do you get project finance and actual debt financing for hundreds of millions of dollars for these infrastructure type of investments? That's where the big need is. And, you know, how do you structure those things so it's not just a bank taking this first of a kind risk, but a government or, you know, some other institution steps in and takes some of the technology risk on those first projects? I think that's where the big need is currently.
Thank you for that, Eric. Adrian, you seem to be doing a lot of nodding there while Eric's talking. Do you have any thoughts on that? Oh, we've just got a little issue with your sound.
Yeah, I totally agree with Eric. basically, there is definitely not enough capital. There is not enough capital in the early stage phase of companies, and the second thing is, what needs to happen is for investors, they need to be sure that we're really on that path, that their investments are going to get profitable, because the price of carbon will eventually rise. And what we see at the moment is just everybody's really want to push in that direction, but it's not really happening. We don't have like a global system where we properly price carbon and where we properly see how you can what we can do with carbon credits and what's the quality of carbon credits. So the market is not in place and the regulation is not in place, at least not properly. And that's what's holding capital back, in my opinion. As soon as we have that going, the money will flow. But that's the job actually of the politicians, I have to say. That's the job also of the society. As you know, Switzerland just declined a CO2 vote. So we had a vote to actually have some sort of carbon tax. And it just, the Swiss people said no, and unfortunately that was 2 weeks ago. So it's also the job of the politician to bring the people on that mission. But business just needs clarity that it's going to be profitable at one point.
Adrian, why do you think that Switzerland did say no to that? Why did the people say no? And just while you're touching there on the role of governments and everyone else, what are the main government interventions needed? How can they help drive money to projects? How to make technologies viable through taxation? How do we drive money then to the green industries?
Well, in my opinion, it's just everything is too complicated, and as so often, it's all about money. So at the very end here in Switzerland, the no campaign, it really only focused on the money part, and they said like it's 12 cents more for a liter of gas. Yeah. I don't want to pay that, and you had like, from the gasoline pump, you had like images where you have people at the gasoline pump. I'm not going to pay 12 cents more. So they had a very aggressive campaign on the cost side, and I think that's the main problem. It was also a problem with the regulation here in Switzerland. I think we need a carbon tax, and you have to redistribute 100% back to the people. So don't make another tax where you make the government bigger or where you try to be funny with innovation projects on the government level, because I'm not sure if governments are really innovative, actually. So in my opinion, the best thing would be to really, to raise a carbon tax and then redistribute 100% back to the people. So the whole money thing wouldn't matter. It's really, flying costs more and your SUV costs more, but if you drive your bike and you don't fly too much, you get more money back. Okay. And I think that's what needs to happen.
Eric and Rebecca, you were both nodding there when Adrian was talking. Eric, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would like to compliment a couple of things. First, I fully agree with the point of Adrian. We must have a compliant market in place, right? The voluntary market for credits for reducing carbon emissions in general is great. I'm not saying this is not bad. And I think also the private sector and civil society has also boosted this side of the demand, having corporations moving forward. But then we have some challenges that can be tackled. For example, quality of credits. Also creating an informal market as well for society and also for natural assets, right? So we definitely need a compliant market in place. And yes, we can call it tax, which as we see the example in Switzerland, hurts the society a little bit more. It sounds like, well, the money is taking from me. So pricing the carbon in a way, this is very much needed. Sometimes depending on how we name it, it can sound different. Same. And I fully agree that it has to, that revenue has to go back to society for a just transition and also to boost innovation, right? So we, with the same resources and funds, we can get to carbon neutrality more efficiently. So I definitely fully agree with the points raised so far.
Thank you, Rebecca. Eric, do you want to give us a few thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that the best example I can think of to put this in a broad perspective is it free to dump solid or liquid waste anywhere? You know, in most countries in the world, like you can't go dump waste around, and it is currently free to dump billions of tons of gaseous waste to the atmosphere. And it's not only that, it's the largest stream of produced waste at all of humanity. There's you know, what, 50 billion tons of GHG equivalent. I don't know the part which is CO2, 35 billion tons. That's more than all the concrete in the entire world all put together. So we produce more gaseous waste and dump it for free than concrete in the world. And I think if people start to understand it shouldn't be free to do that, and governments start to step up and take the role of, hey, you can't dump solid waste, you can't dump liquid waste, you can't dump gaseous waste. And that's when things are going to start to change.
You've got some thumbs up there from your fellow contributors. Rebecca, if I could come to you with this question, we'll start with you about which countries are actually getting it right in their ambitions and their targets for a green economy and a green society. Who's showing the most leadership and why in your assessment?
Many countries, but I would definitely raise Sweden as the go-to example, where for years, since 2015 or 16, we had the private sector, so over 20 sectors sitting together with the public sector and agreeing on targets and way forward. And so private sector saying the technology is at this status, we need this and this and that to reach an optimal, let's say, innovative way forward for reducing carbon emissions. And these are the targets that have been set from the government side, not in the other way around, government setting targets and then the private sector moving forward. So I think that is the great, hope for democracy, is having both sides sitting together and agreeing on the way forward. So Sweden having the one of the first countries to aim at carbon neutrality by 2045, I think it's a great example. So they're aiming at definitely reducing 70% of their emissions as they are nowadays. But then if we talk about waste, for example, waste management, I think the Netherlands and Belgium are great examples, not even having landfills in place. So it's all about this circularity already in the culture, reusing and recirculating materials. Then on the heating, as I was speaking about heating and cooling before, we have Germany already setting carbon pricing for heating and transport. And also now we have the Décret tertiaire in France, also setting a minimum efficiency. So several examples for different things. So I would like to be optimistic and not just raise one. But there is a lot to be done, that's for sure.
Yep, we like to be optimistic. Eric, what about you? Who's getting it right? In your assessment, Eric, who's getting it right?
Sorry, I didn't hear the first part of the question. So I guess from the heavy industrial perspective, I think broadly the most powerful tool that has been used to incentivize, at least in the cement industry, decarbonization is simply the EU ETS. The EU ETS is severely criticized for, giving free allocations, and there's a lot of criticism of it, but it puts economic incentives to lower CO2 products. And if you do that, you'll have technology development. And in the last 20 years of technology development in cement industry, alternative fuels, or other kind of CO2 technologies are largely based on that one example of real economic incentives there. So I think that's an extraordinarily powerful lever. And I think now the implementation of a carbon border adjustment mechanism is now extending that impact to all the trading partners of the EU. And I think that's by far the most powerful tool for incentivizing decarbonization that I've seen in the cement industry. I would say on the other thing that's extraordinarily important for cement, which is carbon capture, utilization, and storage, the US actually has a really, really, I would say, great regulation for incentivizing carbon capture and storage in the 45Q. And I think that is a really good initiative on carbon capture and storage. And I think broadly, the EU and the EU ETS is probably the most powerful thing that's happened for heavy industrial decarbonization that I'm aware of.
Thank you for that, Adrian. Thank you for that, Eric. We're going to move to you, Adrian, and get your thoughts. Obviously, we know all the challenges that are being faced, but it's good to highlight best practice. So who do you think's getting it right?
Well, I'd love to have said Switzerland, but but we've basically failed on that. So I don't I cannot add too much to that. What Eric said. At one point, I want to also stress out is something Rebecca said. It's quality of credits. It's also something I think we need to get right as a society. A lot of people just think planting trees will solve the problem. You know, it's just go to Africa, plant some trees, $5 a tree, done. So I also think actually we should develop a framework where we say what's a carbon credit. It's a different if Climeworks puts away carbon for 20 million years, or if you plant a tree, or and somebody else is cutting the tree again. So I really think the frameworks that we need, they are not in place, definitely not in one country, but they need to be in place in the EU, or better even globally. And one is the price for carbon, and the other is basically the credit system. So how can we sort of have a functioning credit market?
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much. I want to turn next to talk about green premiums, about when will green energy be the cheapest energy? And do you think perhaps because of the COVID scenario, people are a little more concerned about the cost elements at the moment? We'll start maybe with you, Rebecca. We'll go with you again.
So when will green? Okay, so that's a very hard question, which will also depend on the location, right? It's very interesting. I worked in Africa for many years, and actually, you have communities or full countries that will just see renewable energy in their entire life by just using mini grids. So that is the most competitive they can have, actually. And in the case of Europe, I would set the target maximum 2030, when actually green hydrogen will become competitive if everything is put in place. So, and now it's about the private sector and innovation reaching that target. But all energies, all types of renewables and green energy, I would set the target of maximum by 2030 to become the cheapest in the market, yeah, in Europe.
Okay, and Eric, if you want to address that? A few thoughts from you, Eric, if you don't mind. Thank you.
I'm not sure if we lost.
I think we might have done. I just wanted to ask you the same question. Is this the same question, Eric, just about when will green energy?
In the meanwhile, then I can just complement on the last point of Adrian. So Adrian, I think definitely on the quality of credits is very interesting. And you raised that let's set up a transparent framework. And also let's step a little bit back even. Let's, define definitions. What is carbon neutrality and how can you reach it via credit, right? Because you have the credits that will be offsetting, but you actually can also use credits that bring efficiency to technologies. So you're reaching a carbon neutrality, but you're actually not neutral in your emissions. So there is need for definitions first. Yeah. What is carbon neutrality? What is a credit? There is a framework to be set up.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. I mean, I don't know, but for refrigerators, for example, you have an energy, like green, yellow, red, A, B, C. You have some sort of energy. We need something like that for credits, where we can really say, okay, that's a premium A+ credit, and that's basically a D credit. We need definitions, and we need a framework to be able to trade those credits, also to be able to have a market for those. So basically, I think that's something that is not in place at all. I think I've talked with you, Eric, also once about that. I ask actually whenever I talk to another VC or to another institution, I ask them, how do you rate the credits? How do you do that? I mean, everybody has a different view on that, and I think companies like Stripe and obviously Breakthrough Energy from Bill Gates, they start doing a job there, developing some sort of framework. But again, I think it needs to be a government job.
Yeah, but sure. I think one of the ways that those voluntary markets can become more formalized is by the correct interaction with the compliance markets. So for instance, we had a problem with the EU ETS where they started to allow CDMs in a very low quality, 20 years ago. And that was, I would say, an incorrect decision on the EU ETS to give credibility to these CDMs that were low quality. But that same mechanism to have the EU ETS or other kind of compliance market figure out what is a really high quality credit and make sure to only accept that very high quality credit, that can create this premium market of the voluntary credits, I think. So.
Okay, that's great.
Totally agree.
Thank you very much for that.
And the market is what we need. So I think moderator is back.
Yeah, no, I think that we're...
We still can't hear, though.
There's been a lovely flow to the conversation today, and we
can't hear the questions, unfortunately.
Okay, but, we were going to run out of time.
So then I can react also quickly on Eric's point. I think indeed compliance is so needed, but then again we're talking about Europe, right? And compliance can be expected and will be here very soon. But what about Latin America? What about Africa? So that's why I want to we are challenging the voluntary market, but I also want to raise the added value that it has. It will go faster in certain countries. In Brazil, for example, the voluntary market rather than the compliance. And we have to find indeed like quality in between that, but
I think one of the most problematic things, though, in my own thinking about the voluntary markets is the criteria of additionality requires something to not be profitable. Like it's funny because you'll have a double speak in the voluntary markets where the criteria of additionality to investors, the project will say this is a great and profitable project, and then to creditors it will say, oh, this project couldn't possibly exist but for these carbon credits. And I think that kind of focuses on borderline technologies. So really good technologies that reduce CO2 and are profitable don't get any incentive, and the worse the technology is, the easier is for it to, or the worse it is economically, the easier it is for it to make the additionality argument. So you end up incentivizing, instead of the best, most cost competitive, lowest cost of CO2 reduction technologies, you start to incentivize these borderline technologies. They're not terrible, so you can actually give them some money and they can survive, but they're not the best ones. So it's odd to do that, I think, and I think that's a problem.
Thank you for that.
I see the presenters back.
Yes,
we still can't hear you, unfortunately.
Time has beaten us, I'm afraid. So
it looks like the session may be ending.
It is indeed. Thank you very much.
They cannot hear us, actually.
Thank you. Maybe they can hear us.
Time has beaten us, and there was some sound issues there, but thank you very much for your contributions to Rebecca, to Eric.